I'm going to talk about some of the migration mysteries, conservation challenges, and things that we see here in the Straits that links to you guys in the UK and further afield as well along this East Atlantic Flyway. And here in the Straits of Gibraltar, just near Tarifa in Spain, we're right at the epicenter of migration, 14 kilometers from the northern coast of Morocco. So that's our view. It changes pretty much daily with the wind and the cloud cover. And from a migratory bird's point of view, it must really be the center of the world. And to me, it's very much home and very much center of our hearts as well. And one of the great things about being here in the Straits is you can watch visible migration pretty much around the year. Every day there's something going on. So our spring migration is actually already started. We are already seeing white storks returning back even as early as November. The numbers pick up into February, and then we're really into the black kites. And then as we advance into March, April, May, we get more eagles, honey buzzards coming later. And then before you know it, there's a crossover. There's actually birds coming back the other way on the autumn migration. As soon as July, you'll start seeing white storks, black kites going. And then that continues on to November, December, when you get another overlap. So it's a great place to be able to monitor migration. And that gives us a clue as to how the birds are faring on their breeding grounds, particularly when we do the autumn migration counts, because we can see how many young birds are in these soaring migratory flocks. But I'm not just going to talk about some of the soaring birds, which the Straits is so well known for. I'm going to talk about some of the smaller bird migration as well that we get here. Of course, the black kite, the Millenada or the kite fest that we get here is absolutely phenomenal. It's one of the commonest raptors we see here in the Straits, but we get huge numbers. You can see just of black kites in one day, I've seen 20,000 black kites crossing the Straits. Quite an absolute mind-blowing event. And this is a photo just to try and capture that. But to me, it just doesn't capture how amazing that spectacle really is. But that gives us also some clues to what those birds are doing. Because they're a common raptor here, we're able to actually entice them into feeding areas. And by doing that, we're able to actually ring some of these birds. And actually one of these birds was recovered in a little West African country called Benin. And this was recovered by somebody who was actually capturing black kites for voodoo practices and other strange stuff going on there. And he actually got the ring number, got the details, and emailed my colleague at Fundación Migres, Alejandro Onrubia, who he was trying to persuade Alejandro to go and drive all the way from Tarifa here, all the way down to Benin, and pick the black kite up and help it back on its migration. But actually, Alejandro was very persuasive and persuaded this guy to let this black kite go. So I hope to see that black kite one day again crossing the Straits. But you know, not all of them make it, and there are many reasons as to why they don't make it. Some of them natural, and quite a few of them unnatural like that as well. This black kite is a juvenile black kite. It's called Nicky. It's called Nicky because Nicky's holding it, and Nicky was the one to tag this bird. And this is Nicky actually tagging the bird and releasing it. And this gives us a great insight into black kite migration, because we're able to trap quite a few of these black kites, gives them a little stall on their journey, but they're safely released and they can go on their journey like this. But because we're able to capture so many, we can not only track their whereabouts, but we can also study things like wing morphology of different populations coming through at different times. So for instance, those ones from Iberia, shorter wings compared to those ones coming from further afield of Central Northern Europe. So it's quite interesting. And this is new things coming to light about these species that we're starting to understand, and starting to understand more about the morphology and the ecology of migration. And one of those things is tagging, of course, but you know, here at the Straits, it's a really good place to observe tagging, and even just rings. And for the eagle-eyed among you, you might have seen the the yellow ring on the top left-hand white stork. And this bird was actually ringed. We traced it back to the project owner of this project, and they were in touch with us very, very quickly. And they gave us all the details, and this was ringed in a nest in Belgium, just outside a park. And this is the migratory route that we think it took, because there are other sightings along its journey as well. And you can see, you know, it really scoots around the Pyrenees, but it makes a beeline straight for this area, the 14 kilometers, that narrowest point between the two continents. And what barriers, what adventures did it have on its way? And that's one of the things that climate change is throwing up different barriers to these species. White storks are quite different to a lot of different migratory species. Most migration is really driven by photoperiod change, the change in daylight length. So literally, a species like an osprey, for instance, the food resource is still there on its breeding grounds and it's still abundant, but it needs the daylight hours to be able to hunt for longer. And that's why it's going to sub-Saharan Africa, where food is abundant also, but it has that extra length of day to be able to find enough food to survive easily. And but white storks are quite different. They're chasing rain, and the migratory behavior of the white storks is quite early compared to other species. And the reason for that is because they're going down to the Sahelian zone of Africa when just at the end of the rainy season. And that means all the marshlands, all the pools, all the areas are full of water, and they make the best of that food resource before returning to at least the Iberian Peninsula when we're actually in or coming to the end of our rainy season as well. Of course, the Straits is very famous for its soaring bird migration. And there's a very good reason for that, because birds like this short-toed eagle, for instance, can really only cross at this point because it's a very narrow sea crossing. And what's happening to these birds is they're soaring up over the land. They're really well designed for soaring flight, big wings, big wing loading, but they're not very well designed for power flying. And as soon as they reach the Straits, they're trying to find a good thermal to pop up onto, and then they've got to go over that sea, which must be really daunting for them, a real challenge, and probably one of the biggest natural challenges on their migratory route, because even though it's only 14 kilometers wide, because they're dropping all the time. There are no thermals over the sea, unless a thermal, unlikely, but it does sometimes happen, gets pushed out with an offshore wind, and they can catch on that, and that's happy days. But normally there's no thermals over the sea, so they're dropping all the time, and they've got to judge this quite well, because they're soaring up, getting as high as they can, then drifting. As soon as they're drifting, they're dropping all the time. And what they don't want to do is power fly for too long, because powering a wingspan of about 1.75 meters takes a lot of muscularly effort. So they can only do that for a relatively brief period. So they've got to time it just right. And that must be a huge challenge. And for young birds, it must be even more of a challenge, because they've never done this before. And some birds, they go on their own. But just to show you how much of a draw the Straits is to birds like short-toed eagles, a big winged raptor. This is a bird tagged in Italy. And this shows the thing that we didn't really know before, but these birds are coming up through the landmass of Italy, taking a left turn into France, and coming down through the landmass of Spain to cross at the Straits of Gibraltar. The Straits of Messina is far too wide for many of them. It's a real struggle. They really hate crossing water. This is a natural barrier for them. Of course, once they're over the land, they make a relatively easy job of it, because that soaring flight, they're very well designed to do that. They can cover huge areas in very little time. But of course, birds like Egyptian vulture, for instance, and other species don't just face the challenges of natural things either. But one of the things to say about Egyptian vultures, as we're talking about Spain as well, the population of Egyptian vultures globally is in trouble. But in Spain, I'm very happy to say that the Egyptian vulture population is actually increasing. And that's because of a lot of conservation effort in Spain and also along the flyway to help this species as well. And here's a tagged bird showing us exactly the areas in which it's going to, where it's wintering to, the migratory routes it's taking. And this tagging effort really evolves our thinking around conservation. And flyway conservation is quite difficult because it involves working across, well, quite a few borders there that bird's crossing. So other species that we think are also sedentary or more or less sedentary. This is a young Benelli's eagle I saw during lockdown, actually. And again, you might be able to just make out the ring on the leg here. And I was able to actually read this ring. And normally young Benelli's eagles disperse from the nest area around about 100, maybe 200 kilometers. This bird made a long journey, over 1,000 kilometers to reach us here in the Straits of Gibraltar. It was ringed, sorry, in France. And if it took the most direct route, which is highly unlikely, that's the kilometers it would have covered. But of course, it probably took a much more devolved route than that. If you know the Straits, you'll know that it can be quite windy here. We have a sea breeze, normally either from the east, the Levante, or from the west, the Poniente. And as a result, there are many wind turbines in the Straits. Now, being a migratory bottleneck, you kind of think, well, you've got a lot of soaring birds coming through there. That's going to be a bit of a problem, as well as for resident species like griffon vulture, but also the youth dispersal that enters here as well as all these migratory birds. But Fundación Migres, working alongside the wind turbine companies, have come up with mitigation. And this mitigation works really well because it's employing ornithologists 365 days of the year to monitor in all daylight hours the migratory bird movements. And doing so, they can turn off the wind turbines, either using an app, either one turbine, a group of turbines, or the whole zone, to allow safe passage of the birds to move through the area. And once they're moved through, they turn the turbines back on. And this is a hugely successful model because this is something that the guys have actually been able to export into other countries. Egypt, for instance, are now taking this model on as well. And yeah, that's something that's been hugely successful because as we try to mitigate for climate change impacts and we want more renewable energy, this could of course throw up these barriers to migration. And we've got to be careful to site these things in the right place. However, I would say, though, this produces about 18% of Andalusia's energy requirements. So it's a huge production of energy because Andalusia is a very big region in Spain. And so having a win-win here is a really good thing. One of the biggest problems now is actually the power cables. So, and we're working on marking those power cables to see, so the birds can actually see them. One of the other things that I really wanted to stress in this talk about barriers to migration, there are three major barriers: deforestation, hunting, and agriculture. And agriculture is one of the biggest because it actually links to deforestation as well, of course. From WWF's Living Planet report, and if you've not had a perusal of that, I really suggest you do because it's got some really alarming stats in it, but also some solutions as well. One of the biggest barriers to migration is changes in agriculture. And they calculated that 70% of biodiversity loss was caused by food production. That's a huge percentage. And you can extrapolate that to migratory bird populations as well. These birds are moving across different farmed areas or natural areas, which are now being converted to farming, intensive farming as well. And one of those birds that we get passing through here quite a lot is, well, in big numbers. In fact, nearly all of the UK population of turtle doves would pass through this area into Africa and beyond into the Sahel. One of the problems for this species is hunting is one problem for sure, but hunting has probably more or less been stable, although it has declined recently with different country moratoriums. But one of the big problems is agriculture because these birds were having up to 3 to 4 broods in the 60s, from the 90s about 1 to 2, and probably now 1, if you're lucky, in the Northern Hemisphere. And this is caused by a lack of seed food during the breeding season. So those grassland areas, those natural swards have all gone, and the use of herbicides in intensive areas has meant some of their natural food plants have been destroyed. And so they really struggle with food. And that leads to disease and other stress factors that we actually see on migration. And that's one of the things that when you live in a migratory bottleneck, you really do start to see changes in populations quite quickly. And that's one of the things that we've seen a radical decline in, as well as still seeing big numbers of them, but nothing like we used to. One of the real success stories for me, though, here in a little area called Trebejena, not far away, is the rufous-tailed scrub robin. And this just demonstrates to me the absolute art of the possible, because the rufous-tailed scrub robin is quite fussy in what it likes to live in and what it likes to feed on. So it really likes large-bodied insects, even things like Scolopendra, which is this poisonous centipede. It's quite a big species, actually, and I see them hunting them a lot. They seem to really like them. And this species is inhabiting the vineyards of Trebejena. And the reason why it's doing so well there is because the farmers there are taking action for that species. And what they're doing is they're farming in a very sensitive, extensive way with mixed farming. It's not just vineyards, it's other things mixed in there, scrub management. And this is a real benefit to the rufous-tailed scrub robin. And if you joined us for the live we did from there, you probably remember seeing and hearing all these rufous-tailed scrub robins. It is alive with them. But of course, that's just an indicator species, because of course, if you're getting it right for them, you're getting it right for a load of large-bodied insects, as well as other birds and mammals as well. One of the big challenges, though, and is changes in climate, changes in farming, and this is really affecting some of our really long distance migrants. So birds that we would have thought would be commonplace in the Northern Hemisphere are declining rapidly. I should say the spotted flycatcher for us here is still a very common species, but I can only imagine how common it must have been about 50 years ago around here. Other species like common redstart, even barn swallow numbers are varying year on year. And I think that's something you guys are probably seeing more of in the north as well. And this will be due to different climatical change, perhaps, but probably more than likely to do with food resource on their breeding grounds as well. Some of the small bird migration here that we still don't know enough about, because tagging has really not gone as far on smaller bird migrants as it has on larger soaring birds, where we're able to fit lightweight, but in terms of percentage of body weight, lightweight tags on species. We're still relatively constrained on some of these smaller birds like woodchat shrikes, for instance, and even sparrows here are huge migrants. We don't know how many of them cross the straits. And here's a mixed group of house sparrows, and there are some Spanish sparrows in there as well. And we get millions, literally millions of sparrows, and they cross the straits. And we don't really understand how many. We don't understand where they're going to. There are many different mysteries that we still need to solve. And this can give way to conservation measures that we can take for these birds across their migratory routes, wintering grounds or breeding grounds, like collared pratincoll, for instance. We now have a reserve area for them. We have one of the densest breeding populations in Europe of the collared pratincoll, and we see them going down to the Sahel, down to the Gambia, for instance, to winter. But one of the great things about migration here is it is just although we're doing all this conservation work, we're trying to understand, and understanding is really key. But one of the things that I really enjoy doing is showing people this visible migration, because if you know it, you really want to conserve it. And I think that's one of the things that people get when they come here and see huge numbers of white storks, for instance, like these birds passing over my head. I think there are about 900 in this group. We get groups of over 1,000 going, and then you've got to spot the one that's got a ring on. So I'll let you try and find the one there, because I couldn't. Anyway, one of the species I wanted to talk about, or two actually species I wanted to talk about, was some of the vulture species. And there are two African species now occurring here in the Straits. And this is one of them's the Rupel's vulture. This is a sub-Saharan African species that's now occurring as a vagrant, but becoming more and more common in the Straits. And it's one of the few places in the Western Palearctic where you can actually observe this species, normally a Sahelian species. But on its normal area, it is critically endangered. It's declining a lot, and we don't really understand how the Rupel's vulture is interacting when it gets to Europe with griffon vultures. And as griffon vulture numbers are increasing, and we get this youth dispersal going across the Straits, spending their first 2 years or so of their life in the Sahel, then when they're coming back, they're like a conveyor belt for these critically endangered African vulture species. And we think they're bringing them into Europe. But what we don't understand is quite a few questions around what happens to them when they're in Europe. And one of the questions is, do they actually return to their native area? Well, this is a bird called Polswella, and she actually did. She was tagged by the Vulture Conservation Fund in Portugal, and they observed her movements through a satellite tag, and she crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and down into Mauritania and onto just near Dakar. And so she actually did return to her native area. Now, what we don't know is how the birds are interacting on their breeding grounds, on the griffon vulture breeding grounds. We've actually observed these African vultures, the Rupel's vulture, actually copulating with griffon vultures. This could be a real problem for them because they're suffering with agricultural change on their normal areas, poisoning, collision risks, other issues as well. And as that population gets so low, perhaps hybrid populations could actually go to the Sahara and start mixing with those African species. We don't know what's happening. We need to understand that. And we tagged last year Europe's first white-backed vulture being tagged in Europe. And this is the unfortunate victim of this tag. But you can see it's a very lightweight tag. And it flew off with no problems, and we're tracking its movements. Last checkup, it's still in Spain. It's hanging out some griffon vultures. This is a bird normally, again, of the sub-Saharan, the Sahelian region. And we think it will probably return at some stage, but we simply don't know if it follows the same route as the previously tagged Rupel's vulture. But we will find out as we get more and more birds tagged. We have some birds in Morocco being wing tagged as well, some of the Rupel's vultures. And that's leading us to new insights into these two critically endangered birds actually entering Europe as well. Of course, just very briefly on vagrancy as well. Of course, sometimes we see really weird things as well in the Straits. We see birds that shouldn't really be here, like this young lanner falcon, which actually landed right in front of myself and a friend as we were counting black kites and white storks. It was a bit of a moment. It was almost too close. We couldn't move, and then it got attacked by a kestrel. But this vagrancy is actually I don't think of it as a mistake as much. And this is really proved to me by yellow-browed warblers actually occurring in the Los Alcornocales Natural Park here in the Straits, in the biggest cork oak forest in Europe. And this is a bird that's very commonplace, I'd say really a passage migrant now in the UK in October. And we're actually getting these birds in November. And I think there's some of the same birds passing through the UK. And what we think is happening, we think that birds are coming here to winter, maybe even further down into Africa to winter, but we don't know yet. But what we do know is we actually ringed one of these yellow-browed warblers, and we observed it back in the same area the following year. And this is not a great photo, but to me it's a great photo because we can just about read the ring, and we were able to prove that it was the same yellow-browed warbler, and this is the first time winter site fidelity has ever been recorded in vagrant yellow-browed warblers. Now, what we think is happening, this is vagrancy, this is how birds have conquered the world. This is one of the marvelous things about birds. What we think is happening is actually yellow-browed warblers are probably, quite possibly, breeding up in, some are in the western or boreal forest, and we don't know where they are. We don't understand where they are, but people have heard them singing up in that area. And what's probably happening is, as that vagrancy has occurred, those birds are starting colonizing new areas. That's what vagrancy does. That's why it happens. And now we're seeing that happening as a wintering bird here in the Straits and potentially beyond as well. Anyway, that's just like a whistle-stop tour. I kind of like could go on forever about migration. I bore people about migration, but hopefully that's given you some insight into some of the mysteries that we're trying to unsolve, which is helping us better understand some of the practices that we need to deploy to help these migratory birds. And living here in the Straits really brings it home to us because, well, we just love migration and we just love seeing you guys enjoy it as well. So we hope you visit soon. And yeah, thanks for listening.